We're moving on to something actually that it's in a way is related, because it's also to do with the impact upon health. And this is the demonstration by Extinction Rebellion. And I know when people say Extinction Rebellion, a lot of people say, oh, right, that's, again, it's down to their ignorance. It's down to the fact that they think that their lives are somehow being detrimentally affected by other people standing up for the climate and wanting to see quite radical changes that hopefully will preserve the same people's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren in the future. So, you know, these people should be apologizing for their groans when they see Extinction Rebellion. They should not apologizing to us or Extinction Rebellion. They should be apologizing to their own children and grandchildren. That's nothing. Okay, so this is the point of view. This is another article we had on Dorset Eye earlier last week, and it focuses upon specifically the individual health impact of climate change. And I think it's really worth, you know, obviously people going onto the site and reading it, Tom, but it's specifically we need to focus here, because if we have seen society atomized, you know, we have seen society atomized over the last 30 or 40 years, where people who become more selfish, more self-obsessed, less compassionate, less empathetic. And so when it comes to talking about things like climate change, for example, people seeing it as something very huge, something abstract, something they can't really affect. Therefore, it doesn't really have a knock-on effect for their lives. However, when Extinction Rebellion come along and close a road, that does have an impact upon their day-to-day experiences. And so they rebel against that. You know, they revile the Extinction Rebellion activists who sit in the road and mean they've got to be sat in their cars for 20 minutes, you know, beeping their horns and swearing. And yet the global warming that's going on around them, which will have an absolutely, you know, apocalyptic effect upon the planet and on our species, oh, it's something I can't affect. Hang on, let's look at then what it is going to do to you, to your children and your grandchildren. Okay, 10 hazards for individual health. Power outages in extreme weather could cripple hospitals and transportation systems when we need them most. Crop declines could lead to undernutrition, hunger and higher food prices. So you go to the supermarket now, and you're suddenly going to be paying a lot more, not just because of, you know, the Tory Brexit, but because of climate change. More CO2 in the air could make staple crops like barley and soy less nutritious. Occupational hazards such as risk of heat stroke will rise, especially among farmers and construction workers. Labour could shift to dawn and dusk times when most disease-carrying insects are out. Hotter days, more rain, and high humidity will produce more ticks, which spread infectious diseases like Lyme disease. Trauma from floods, droughts, and heat waves could lead to mental health issues like anxiety, depression, and suicide. More heat can mean longer allergy seasons and more respiratory disease. More rain increases mold, fungi, and indoor air pollutants. Mosquito-borne dengue fever, people might not think, oh, it really affects me, has increased 30-fold in the past 50 years. 3/4 of those exposed so far live in the Asia-Pacific region. Senior citizens and poor children, especially those already afflicted with malaria, malnutrition, and diarrhea, tend to be most vulnerable to heat-related illnesses. Drought and chronic water shortages harm rural areas and 150 million city dwellers. If localities don't adjust quickly, that number could be nearly 1 billion by 2050. Rising sea levels can threaten fresh water supplies for people living in low-lying areas. So people on the coastline, even in the UK, are suddenly going to find that lots and lots of their money is not going to be spent on leisure activities. It's going to be spent on making sure that their houses aren't washed away. More severe storms can cause city sewage systems to overflow. And here we have photographs of doctors in London being prepared to be arrested, cajoled, sometimes, you know, violently harassed by security, trying to make this point, because, you know, we have surgeons here, we have consultants here who know what's coming. And if we're not prepared to listen to the doctors and the consultants, then for many people, it's just a case of, you know, it's going to be a fait accompli. And we'd also, just to finish off on this bit, Tom, before I pass back to you, we also need to be aware of why is it that the state is so actively trying to suppress and manipulate people when it comes to those groups who are standing up and saying we need to act dramatically now. Because they're not just doing it because, oh, you know, I don't like the look of them, a bit scruffy. They're doing it because their economic interests now, in this moment, are going to be significantly affected and challenged by people suddenly saying we now need to be spending trillions to revamp the planet in order for us to be able to, one, meet the climate disaster head on, but two, try and avert much of what is coming, or at least put it off for a substantial amount of time. But for these people, that they know that by doing so will reduce their shareholders' dividends, it will reduce their investment, it will reduce their stock values, it will mean they have a more tenuous attachment to their material possessions. It's about them, which is why they're propagating this myth, this idea that somehow climate change is not related to human activity, even though the evidence all stacks up and says it absolutely is. It is related to somehow to do with sunspots or volcanoes. Yes, sunspots and volcanoes will have an influence, but as we have seen, the influence tends to be very short-term, empirically and historically. But the effect of industrialization from the 1840s and 1850s onwards by humans and the use of fossil fuels is the absolutely numero uno reason why we have seen during that time such a dramatic change in temperatures and why so many species have died. So the point being is, if we don't listen to the doctors who really want us to be healthier in the future, they want us to avert the disasters, don't want to be in a position where they're constantly having to dish out medicines to respond to illnesses that actually could have been avoided if we changed our behavior earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. A fascinating article, and yeah, the 10 things listed there were interesting to have a look through. Urge people just to have a look through that article in its entirety. Yeah, I mean, whilst the 10 things there were salient and significant to all of us, you could argue, you know, from a climate change perspective, they were a little bit, some of them were a little bit first world problems ish, in that, you know, that it was an attempt by the doctors to highlight how in places like in this country, our health is being and will continue to be, to a greater extent, detrimentally affected by climate change. Some of those things are already happening in a far more serious way in the global south. So, you know, where it says about, you know, it could be an increase due to crop failures and what have you, you know, there could be an increase to the cost of our cereals or bread or whatever, our food. You know, people in the global south are already dying of you know, starvation due to crop failures. So, I mean, some of those things are written for us as an audience, but we also should recognise that the situation is far more severe for people in poorer parts of the world, in particular in the global south, where already the you know, the ravages of climate change are you know, are having severe detrimental effects and causing death, and will do far more than they will affect us in the short term. So yeah, the other thing I wanted to pick up on was the thing about mosquitoes and the viruses that mosquitoes carry. I read an interesting article fairly early on in the pandemic, looking at the future of viruses and pandemics. or virus-based pandemics across the globe. And the article pointed out that respiratory viruses such as COVID-19 are very dangerous. There's viruses like Ebola which pass through human contact, which are far more easy to control because you can stop human contact. Then there's respiratory diseases pass through respiration, through our breath, and particles, particles emitted as we speak and breathe, harder to control or eradicate, but still possible. And then there's viruses spread by mosquitoes, which are possibly, or generally regarded as the most difficult to prevent, to stop. And the article was saying that due to global warming, there are kind of two types of mosquitoes: those that live in tropical climates and those that live in non-tropical climates. And malaria, for example, it's a tropical climate disease, and it isn't carried by mosquitoes in the UK, for example. But as global warming occurs, there's a migration. The migration of mosquitoes, will continue apace.
Yes.
And it won't be that much longer in terms of, a few decades till the tropical climates required for the mosquitoes that carry things like malaria will have moved up and up and up, north and north and north, until it reaches, the UK, in 50 years, maybe even Scandinavia, will be filled with mosquitoes that can live in tropical climates and carry malaria, and not just malaria, but possibly the most dangerous type of pandemic causing virus. So malaria obviously is a huge risk, but in future there could be something like, like a coronavirus that is transmitted by mosquitoes. And if mosquitoes cover most of the planet in 50 years, that could be an extinction event.
And if they think
almost impossible to stop.
Absolutely. And if they think that at the moment with COVID-19 that they have to create this red, amber, green process for people traveling around the world, imagine the scenario if what you've just said and from the article is reality in 50 years, because most of everything south of the equator certainly will be red, and a lot of things north of the south, the equator, will be red. And you're probably only going to start hitting amber when you get into northern France. So actually, it's not just about this idea, it's not going to affect me, it's on the other side of the world, I'll never go to those places anyway. In a short space of time, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, they simply won't be able to travel. It'll be like a locked-in syndrome for nations.
Yeah, absolutely. Be too dangerous to travel to vast amounts of the world, and even where we live ourselves may be dangerous. We may be, covering our houses with mosquito nets, not venturing outside without being covered in, head to toe protection. But
even when
human mosquito nets will be wearing.
Even when we do, Tom, all the things that we import, we depend upon, we either won't be able to afford, or because these diseases will be ravaging so many people across the globe, they weren't even being produced. Yeah. And I mean, going back to the crops thing, people don't realize the danger of global crops failing and not being able to be produced. And I read an article, I think, on Dorset Eye recently that mentioned the currents of the Atlantic. What's it called? The main jet stream. Jet stream.
Jet stream or Gulf Stream or jet stream.
Gulf Stream, jet stream. Yeah.
Gulf Stream. The current, and how that actually affects crops, and how it's at risk of kind of stopping or reversing from its traditional path, and how that can devastate crops, which would have a massive effect globally in terms of famine. and vast numbers of people dying, and affecting the foods that we eat in the developed world. So yeah, there's, it's right. It's, well done to the doctors that are highlighting these issues, fighting for recognition of climate change. The article there goes on to talk about how the right-wing interests have spent decades lying about climate change, how politicians, but also, as we know, fossil fuel industries have invested billions over decades lying in different ways about climate change. They've known the truth and they've lied about it for profit. They've been happy for millions and billions of people to die, and potentially for the whole human race to be extinguished so that they can make profit now. That's what they've been about for decades. The proof of that is fully evidenced now. It's all out there. What the fossil fuel companies, in cahoots with right-wing politicians or politicians of all persuasions, to be honest, and the billionaire corporate media, have all been in cahoots to lie to us about the dangers, just for a couple of decades worth of profits.
And I don't think it's just the lies. In fact, I think the lies are probably secondary to the fact that they kept it off the agenda and the menu in the first place.
Yeah.
By keeping it off the menu, you don't have to lie, because people simply don't think about it.
Yeah.
It's only when it's increasingly, people started pointing things out and recognizing the issues and traveling around the world and bringing back information and sharing that information. And scientists have been out there, giving us the data, etc., and the expectations that we can have. Suddenly, the big corporate institutions who stand to lose so much money are having to find a way of hitting back, like you say, with the lies and the propaganda. But while they successfully kept it away from us, our consciousness, they were laughing.
Yeah, and that's why Extinction Rebellion, people must recognize that the tactics used by Extinction Rebellion are the ones that have to be used in order to raise public consciousness, to get it into the news, to get the issues out there, to raise public awareness, to make people aware of the issues. If they weren't stopping the traffic, if they weren't gluing themselves to bridges and the undersides of lorries, it wouldn't be in the news and people wouldn't be knowledgeable about it.
No.
Because people attack Extinction Rebellion over their tactics. Say, oh yeah, I agree with them, but why do they have to hold up the traffic and stop ordinary working people getting to work, and stuff? And that's the reason. If they don't do that, it doesn't make the news, and people remain in the dark for another couple of decades until we're all dead.
Yep.
And until our children and grandchildren say, disown us and say, I'm never speaking to you again for allowing this to happen. So well done, Extinction Rebellion. They should use whatever means necessary to highlight this, threat to our existence.
Yeah, and the message has got to be, to finish off with, don't blame Extinction Rebellion, blame the corporate media for ignoring it for so long and misinforming.
Yeah, absolutely.
And talking of, which we seem to be doing rather a lot of, and we have done over the last 20 episodes, Tom,